Nasties, and welcome to She Who Persisted, the Nasty podcast. I am your host, Elizabeth, and today we have an interview with Dr. Emma Vossen. Emma is an award-winning public speaker and a postdoctoral research fellow at York University with a PhD from the University of Waterloo. Her research looks at the myriad of ways that marginalized people have difficulty accessing gameplay and games culture, both historically and in the present. She's the co-author and co-editor of the anthology Feminism in Play, which looks at feminist approaches to gameplay. Our interview looks at the way women and women-identifying people are marginalized in game society. We talk a little bit about incels, a little bit about Gamergate, and a lot about what we can do to make games a safer place for marginalized people. And we hope you enjoy the interview.
She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted.
Emma, can you introduce yourself to us and tell us your pronouns?
I'm Dr. Emma Vossen, and I use she, her pronouns.
Great. So I wanted to have you on the show because your research is so interesting, particularly in light of a lot of the discussions that go on around women in gaming and gamer culture, which may or may not have some kind of intersections with incel culture, and we can kind of talk about all of that. But before we get started talking about your research, I want our audience to know you're Canadian. So what's your perspective on the dumpster fire that is U.S. politics right now?
I mean, I guess on the one hand, I should say that like my most read Medium piece is an essay about how like to my fellow Canadians about how they all need to like stop shitting on Americans, because like we're not much better.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's, there's a lot of, when you live in Canada, there's a lot of like smugness around US politics.
We think of Canadians as being like real friendly.
Yeah, no, that's bullshit. I mean, like, I like to think I'm an extremely friendly person. But there is like, I think there's just a real smugness around, like, I remember, you know, when everything was happening, there was this sort of idea that, oh, like, well, this would never happen to us because we're so much better than that. And, you know, all of that stuff, which is ridiculous because like as a continent, we share the same culture. We share the same cultural values, in my opinion, especially, you know, in the age of the internet. So I think I should put that up front that like, I don't want to be like the smug Canadian in any way. But at the same time, I guess it's from my research perspective, it's been really fascinating, you know, because I started doing this sort of research about games culture in, you know, like 2011, 2012. And it was really amazing to watch amazing as in horrible, to watch the ways in which American politics started to sort of like reflect the norms of games culture that I was studying, you know. A lot of people, you know, now people will say like, oh, this debate about like political correctness, this is like one of the foremost debates of our time. And it's so weird to me when like I saw that whole debate play out in games culture and everyone sort of made fun of it and you thought it was over. And then it became like the sort of forefront of the US election. You know, the first time I heard someone say the word social justice warrior on TV, I literally thought I was going to pass out because I was like, this can't be happening. Like, this cannot be real. And, you know, I think, so I guess I think my perspective is very interesting because I was one of the only Canadians I know who was like, Trump is going to get elected. You know, the night that Trump got elected, I gave 2 lectures on sort of like the connection between games culture and cultural politics at large. And in both those lectures, I was like, you know, brace yourself, Trump is going to get elected tonight. And even all the students were like, ha, 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 ha.
That can't possibly happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Here,
and
hold
then, of
my
course,
beer.
it happened. Yeah, yeah. So I guess that's sort of like my situated perspective is this almost like one of the things I talk about a lot in the conclusion of my dissertation is almost having like a weird survivor's guilt or something that I think is something that Zoe Quinn talks about in her book quite a bit too, where, you know, everything that happened during Gamergate, we were so vocal about like, oh God, this is like a really big problem. This isn't about games. This isn't just games. And then to sort of like watch the same conversations play out on like a national level is it's like weirdly, I don't know, re-traumatizing or something.
Yikes. Yeah, it's not great from our perspective either. So yeah, I mean, yes. So let's talk about your research a bit. I mean, you've mentioned it, and this is a super loaded question. But tell us about your research. Give us like the elevator pitch of your research.
Yeah. So I guess in the most general way possible, my research looks at games culture. It looks at issues of diversity, inclusion, and belonging within games culture. And it looks at how those issues affect people with different identities. So how your experience of games culture and the norms that take place within that specific culture are going to affect you differently if you are, you know, a woman, or if you're trans, or if you're a person of color, if you're queer, that sort of thing. I guess that's the elevator pitch version.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So I think a lot of times we have a tendency to think that in these virtual spaces, you can create an identity for yourself and you can be whomever you want. And so, you know, if I want to have a male, as a, you know, cisgendered woman, if I want to have a male character that I'm playing like in game, does that change how people interact with me in game then, because they don't know whether I'm a woman or a man?
Yeah, it definitely can. You know, if we're thinking about multiplayer gaming, I know like a lot of women who play using male avatars because, you know, there's this sort of idea that maybe you'll get more, not even like necessarily you'll get more respect, but like maybe you just won't be noticed if you aren't on voice chat. I know that it was a huge thing when I like, you know, back in the day when I was playing like old school World of Warcraft, I played as a female character. And it's interesting because at that time it was just so assumed that there was no way that other players were female, that when I would be talking to someone and I would say that I was a female, or a woman, they would be like, I can't believe I just said a female. that was a slip. When people would find out I was a woman, they would just be like, well, no, prove it. Like, I don't believe you. Like,
I mean,
there's no way. How
exactly did they want you to prove it over voice chat? Like, did they want you to like, I mean, how does
I mean, don't get me wrong. I definitely would get the like, well, show me your tits then.
Stop.
Yeah, or like show me your tits for gold was like at the time like a big thing. I don't think that's a real thing anymore. But this was, you know, like 10 years ago or more, I should say. But, you know, sometimes I would get the question like, are you a girl in real life? You know, just girl IRL was how it was often phrased. And I started to lie, honestly. Like at first I would tell the truth because I would be like, yeah, I'm a girl, like in your face. But then it's like, it stops being worth it. It's easier to just lie. And, you know, now like as an adult, when I play multiplayer games, it's easier to just play without a headset on. And if there's games that absolutely you have to wear a headset, like I just don't play them because it's just adding a sort of a secondary complication to what I really want to do, which is just like relax and play games in peace.
Sure. So, I mean, and this kind of intersects with the Gamergate issue too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The like harassment, like as of, I almost did it too, female gamer, as a woman playing games as part of gamer culture, as part of comic culture, as part of a lot of like genre culture. Generally, there have been some real issues for women.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing is there is this sort of, it's an overlap, right? So like it starts with this assumption, these assumptions that one, you know, if you're playing games, you probably aren't a woman or a girl. If you are a girl or a woman, you're playing games, there must be something wrong with you. Like there must be a reason why you do this.
Mm-hmm.
Third, a sort of like biological inferiority assumption, like you physically cannot, or physically and mentally cannot be as good at games as someone who's
hold on a second. These are video games, yeah. Like you're sitting with a controller on on a couch in a chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you like your thumbs and fingers don't have like the physical dexterity to be good at them?
Yeah,
or?
I think it comes down to sort of assumption of dexterity. I mean, there's even weird discourse in games culture about race and dexterity. Like people will insist that, you know, people who are like people who are of certain races have better dexterity when playing games, which obviously is a whole other loaded issue. But I think the thing is there are less women in professional gaming, but it is for social and cultural reasons. It's not because
they're not as good at it.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, unfortunately, a lot of people still assume that. So I guess that those assumptions are sort of the base of all other harassment that, you know, you may encounter in game or on Twitter. You know, I think there was like some tweets that were going around yesterday where there was some guy who was just like doing a really loud screaming, like, this is my hobby. And yes, I gatekeep my hobby and I'll tell you to get out if I want to, because it's mine and I need to protect it. And this whole thing. And like the woman he was yelling at just responded and was like, dude, like you were born in 1996. Like I literally have been playing video games for like 10 years longer than you've been alive.
Sure. I mean, my husband, he's been playing D&D. I mean, a different type of games, but still gamer culture, and they have the same issues as video game culture. And he's been playing it since like the late 70s. And, you know, if there were women who were interested in like being in his gamer group, he was totally welcome of them. I mean, I think that there were some, you know, there were some cultural things of like the anti-D&D movement and all of that left, like made a lot of people not interested in D&D generally. And like the fact that people who play D&D are often like culturally stigmatized anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I'm a Gen Xer. And so for me to hear like either a millennial or a Gen Z or whatever say like, you can't be part of this. It's like, oh, come, like, this is my thing. Like, oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And like, obviously, like, I'm a fan of like people, like, I don't care, obviously, if somebody has no qualifications. Like, if you've never played a video game before, I'm not going to be like, you've never played a video game before. But it's really exhausting when people are trying to like exclude you from a culture you've been part of for so much longer than they have. You know, it's so exhausting, you know. And I think about this a lot because I teach, and, you know, a lot of my students, like the way they talk about games, like they talk about games like the PS2 is old, you know, and like when I tell them the first game I ever played was, you know, on the Commodore 64, they're just like, what? Like, and I think, so it's
what does 64 stand for?
Like, it's just, it's beyond their perception. So like, I guess it's just to know exactly like where those kids are at, because I teach games to people who are the same age. I shouldn't say kids, they're like 19, 20, but
you sound like an old lady.
Yeah.
Not to be ageist, but
yeah, I do. But yeah, it's really frustrating when you know exactly from teaching like what mindset they're coming from, and it's just that this idea that like, oh, you've just decided that you like video games or D&D or whatever because it's cool now. It's just exhausting.
Well, I had to suffer to make it cool.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that you bring up an interesting point, though, both in your research and in like just this conversation that we've been having. And I think that, you know, I talked to a historian about women in computing, and this was a similar thing. You know, we don't see as many women in like gamer culture because it's maybe not a welcoming environment, not that they aren't interested in going into those fields. And so one of the things that your research really brings to light is this issue of exclusion, and whether it's possible to create spaces of inclusion, particularly in gaming. And I think we see this translating to, you know, other spaces, academia. We see this in computing, in engineering, in STEM fields generally, but, you know, a lot of different places. So what do you think maybe the biggest impact of your research could be to this idea of creating spaces of inclusion?
Yeah, that's a really good question and very difficult to answer succinctly. So I guess like one of the things I've found in my research is that, I have an entire chapter of my dissertation where I talk about attending